we've all been living through the pandemic. So the question is, what kind of post-pandemic recovery is there going to be? Is there underway for the economy and for business? And to try and answer that question, I posed myself 4 questions, partly on the principle that it's easier to answer questions that you've set yourself. So the first one is whether the strong recovery, and we certainly did embark on a very strong recovery a few months ago, whether that is continuing or whether there are signs of that might be petering out. Secondly, about COVID. I mean, we're obviously still very nervous about the coronavirus. Is it going to upset our best laid plans? Could there be problems over the winter months? We've already had 3 lockdowns. Is there any question of another? Thirdly, inflation, topic of the moment. You may have seen the latest figures for inflation, 4.2% last month, which is the highest we've had for 10 years, and is expected to go higher. What will the Bank of England do in response to that? And in doing so, to what extent will that affect the recovery? And the final thing I wanted to talk about was tax. This has been a big year for announcements of tax increases, although none of them have yet taken effect. Has the Chancellor done enough or to pay for the pandemic and to fix the public finances? Will we need to see even more tax increases? So those are the 4 questions I've set myself, but I wouldn't want you to think you're restricted to those issues. There are various other things we can talk in more detail on supply difficulties, on labor shortages, all the things that are coming through at the moment. When Rishi Sunak established the furlough scheme in March 2020, something we've never seen before in the UK. There have been similar schemes in other countries, and most notably Germany, but something we've never seen before in the UK. The last thing he expected was that we would emerge from the pandemic with labor shortages. So we can talk about labor shortages, supply shortages. We can talk about Brexit, if you like, and the fact that the government is making noises about invoking Article 16, to which the EU has warned that there could be a trade war. So we can talk about that. We've just had COP26. What is the onus on business of going green? Business made a big contribution to COP26, which I think would have been regarded as a great success, if not for the last-minute intervention of China and India. So again, we can talk about that. Business rates, are they ever going to be properly reformed? And the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, has said we want a high-wage, high-productivity economy. Can we have a high-wage economy without high productivity? So again, we can talk about that as well. So, and anything else you care to mention. So let me tackle the first one. We're in the middle of a strong global recovery. COVID was a global event, biggest recession for the world economy in the post-war period, bigger than the recession caused by the global financial crisis just over a decade ago. But we're in quite a strong recovery from that. And the way this slide on screen works is that the top line is what this particular organization, the OECD, expected to happen in the absence of the pandemic, so a straight line of growth. The bottom line is what they thought would happen around about this time last year. And you remember this time last year, we hadn't had a vaccination, a COVID vaccination anywhere in the world, the first one being in December last year to that lady in Coventry. So that has improved the outlook. And so, the OECD thinks that the world economy is now on the middle of those 3 lines. So something somewhat stronger than they previously expected. And if you look, for most parts of the world, the story is pretty similar. That big recession in 2020, stronger growth this year and next than the average of the previous 10 years. So quite a pronounced bounce in global economic activity, in world trade, in economic growth. I suppose the difference between this and the picture you might have been more familiar with over the years is that the difference between growth in what we might call the advanced world, the industrial countries, is somewhat stronger relative to the emerging world than it has been. And that, I think, is a vaccination story. Most advanced countries have done pretty well in terms of vaccination rollout. Many countries, the UK made a great start, but many countries have now overtaken the UK in terms of vaccination rollout. But for large parts of the emerging world, there aren't the vaccines, there haven't been the vaccines, and vaccine take-up has been very low. So that is why the gap between advanced economy growth and emerging economy growth is smaller than we've been used to. If we look at the UK economy, this is monthly GDP. We're quite fortunate that monthly GDP figures only became available relatively recently, just before the pandemic. So they give us a more up-to-date picture than the usual quarterly measure. And what these tell us is that we're pretty close to getting back to where we were before the pandemic. So monthly GDP in September was only 0.6% below where it was in February 2020, before the pandemic struck. And we also have quarterly GDP figures, and the test on the quarterly figures is slightly more onerous, that on a quarterly basis we're still something like 2% below. But on both of these, we're heading back to where we were, recovering the lost output from the pandemic, roughly 2 years from when it started. So we get back to the pre-pandemic peak roughly 2 years after 2 years, and that compares with, so that is quite a quick recession and recovery. It is very pronounced. I think when we look back on it, this is a slightly odd shape. You might call it a square root, you might call it something else. But when we look back on this, we'll think of it as a V-shaped recession and recovery. Very sharp downturn. The downturn was of a scale we haven't seen before. As I mentioned, biggest annual fall in GDP for 100 years. The quarterly fall that we experienced during the first lockdown in the spring of last year was off the scale in terms of previous experience. The previous biggest quarterly fall in GDP in the post-war period was during the 3-day week in 1974, when GDP fell by 2.7%. In the second quarter of last year, having experienced a lockdown, which we hadn't had before, never had a lockdown before. We'd had pandemics before, but never lockdowns. The GDP fell by 19.5%. So something like 8 or 9 times the previous record fall. But we're pretty close to getting back. 3 years is the average time it takes to get back from a recession to your previous level. 5 years after the financial crisis. 2 years is pretty quick. So dramatic, but quite quick. But there are some strange features. So any of you have anything to do with retailing, you may know that the last few months have been a bit disappointing. When non-essential retailing was reopened in April, a lot of retailers thought that this was going to be good times for many months to come. In fact, retail sales have fallen for 5 months in a row, and some of the changes that we saw as a result of the pandemic, the shift to online, these include online sales, by the way, they seem to have lasted into the recovery. So pre-pandemic, slightly less than 20% of retail sales were online. During the pandemic, it got up to more than 30%. Now it's still in the high 20s. So some of that shift has lasted. And perhaps as a result of that, we've seen that businesses aren't quite as confident as they were. Business confidence has come down, very strong in the spring, weakened somewhat in recent months. Although this is from the Institute of Directors, and the point they make is that it is stabilizing, albeit at these lower levels. Consumer confidence is also somewhat weaker than it has been. I mean, it's not exceptionally weak. It's certainly not as weak as it was during 2020, but it is weaker than it has been. Consumer confidence has also softened somewhat in the last few months. And the reasons for that will not surprise you, that supply shortages and labor shortages are causing problems for many sectors, and that is affecting business confidence. I think, you know, this whole business of whether you can turn an economy off and turn it on again, you know, this is proving to be more of a challenge than I think was expected. The fact that all economies are being turned on simultaneously means that supply difficulties, supply shortages are emerging. And as I said earlier, the last thing one might have expected after a pandemic would have been the kind of labor shortages that we are now experiencing in some sectors. Consumers, you know, they are seeing the inflation coming through, they're seeing the higher energy prices, and that is affecting consumer confidence. But part of the weakness of retail sales is because consumers have other things that they're able to spend on. They can spend on entertainment, they can spend on eating out, they can now spend on holidays, foreign holidays as well. So I think there's some diversion away from retail sales to other things. Business investment, you know, business investment was provided with a huge incentive by the Chancellor in his March budget, the super deduction against corporation tax. But business investment has yet to kick in significantly. I think it probably will. I think 2022 will be a good year for business investment, but it's taking time to come through. Some of those difficulties in terms of delivery times, you see it here. This is one of the Purchasing Managers Survey, Purchasing Managers Index for manufacturing. And the way these indices work, if they're above 50, things are pretty normal, or around 50. If they're below it, things are not normal. And delivery times, this is telling us, are a long way from normal. You know, you see that across many sectors. You know, for a long time, you know, if you went into a new car showroom, the salesperson would bite your hand off. Now we've got really long waiting times for new cars, you know, 6, 9, 12 months even. We haven't seen that for a long time and this is because of the chip shortages. It's producing some really odd effects. You know, the oddest effect of all is that used car prices have really shot up. You know, they've gone up by about 18% since April. And that doesn't normally happen. You know, people with money to spend, and people do have a lot of money to spend. You know, one of the things that happened during the pandemic was this big buildup in what is known in the jargon as involuntary savings. You know, people couldn't spend on the things they normally would spend on, including, you know, those things I mentioned, eating out, hospitality, holidays, and so on. So there is 150 billion plus of those excess savings, if you like, ready to be spent. Will they be spent? You know, most people think a proportion of them will. Some of it is feeding into the housing market, some of it is going elsewhere. So there is that, you know, that money waiting to be spent. And the overall message I have, you know, you see it in the employment figures, which are very strong. This doesn't incorporate the latest ones, which were up again, but the number of employees on payrolls has been rising very, very strongly, up another 160,000 last month. And that tells us that employers, that businesses are confident enough to employ. The public sector is also employing more than it was, but this is mostly a private sector phenomenon. You also see it in the vacancy figures. You know, I always make the point that it's easier to advertise job vacancies now than it used to be. And what, you know, one of our great regrets at the Sunday Times is that we no longer have these vast sections of appointments adverts, because you know, we used to have 24 pages of executive appointments ads. Sometimes in a busy week we'd have 2 appointment sections. You know, for the Guardian it was always teacher appointments. For the Sunday Times it was always executive appointments. And they have fallen away almost completely. The only appointments ads we get really these days are the ones from the public sector, because they are still required to advertise in a national newspaper. But even with that caveat, you know, 1.2 million job vacancies over the latest 3 months, 1.3 million in October. That tells us that this is still pretty strong, and the recovery is still pretty sound. And you see that from the latest survey readings, a little bit of a dip in activity over the summer. But again, this is the Purchasing Managers Survey for the service sector, picked up pretty strongly in October, suggesting that the fourth quarter has started pretty well, which I think is always giving us is giving us something of a leg up into 2022. And when we look at the the official forecast and the numbers, this is quite similar to the chart I showed at the start for world economic activity. This one is from the Office of Budget Responsibility, the official forecaster. As you can see, the top line is what would have happened, they think, in the absence of the pandemic. The bottom line is their forecast earlier in the year, and the blue line in the middle is their latest forecast, which was last month. So it is somewhat stronger, and it is consistent with 6.5% growth this year. We haven't seen growth like that since 1973, and 6% in 2022. And we haven't seen a 2-year run like that in the modern era. So two years of 6% or so growth is exceptionally strong. The context, of course, is that last year was very weak. Second question was what about COVID? Can we relax about COVID? Can we stop worrying about this? The Prime Minister sometimes says that, in response to the fact that some European countries are experiencing an increase in cases at the moment, that, we have to be wary of a wave coming from Europe. I mean, it is precisely the other way around. We've been running high case numbers for many months now, alongside the relaxation of restrictions, averaging, roughly 40,000 a day. That is continuing. I think as long as vaccinations and boosters and all that means that this does not convert into hospitalizations much higher than we've got at the moment, or deaths much higher than we've got at the moment, the NHS does not get overwhelmed as it was in danger of getting overwhelmed, I think we can get away without further lockdowns. We probably will have some restrictions, maybe people will be encouraged to work from home again, more than at the moment. Maybe there will be more of an emphasis on mask wearing. It's quite interesting when you go to different parts of the UK, I'm sure some of you are, that there are different restrictions in different parts. You are still pretty much required to wear masks in shops in Wales, and there are, COVID passports are being used more extensively in Scotland and Wales than they are in England. But I think the real issue at the moment is where there isn't a big take up in vaccines because of availability. The way this map works is that the white areas are where there are very low vaccine numbers, so large parts of Africa, some other parts of the world, the lighter shades there, where vaccine numbers are still quite low. So on the principle that nobody's safe till everybody's safe, there is still work to be done here. And what this means is that things like international travel will not return to normal, I don't think, for some time. So complete normality is still some way away. But as I say, I think we can get through the winter without a further lockdown, just with some more restrictions. What about inflation? Topic of the moment. I say we've already got 4.2% consumer price inflation, higher retail price inflation. This is a chart from the Bank of England. It's known in the jargon as a fan chart. I always say about this way of presenting forecasts that it's a great way of presenting forecasts because you can never be entirely wrong. And the bit to their central forecast is the reddest bit of this, which has inflation rising to 5% next spring and then coming down. But if you look at that reasonably closely, you'll see that it doesn't come down to 2%, which is the target, for a while. So inflation is going to last a bit longer than the bank originally thought. And it's come through more quickly. And again, this is all related in part to the condition in which we're emerging from the pandemic. A big recession normally creates spare capacity in the economy, which bears down on inflation. The fact that we're coming out of the recession with shortages, supply shortages, labor shortages, means that this is highly unusual and means that inflation has come through very quickly in the very early stages of recovery. And that doesn't normally happen. It's reflected in business costs and prices, producer prices for industry. Raw material and fuel prices are going up very strongly. Industry's costs, what we used to call factory gate prices, now rising by 8% year on year. So, to the extent that these are traditionally called pipeline inflation pressures, these are still coming through quite strongly. House prices, again, we've had a new reading for this just now, and that's house price inflation is nearly 12% at the moment. So again, this is not something we would have expected in the recession. The housing story has been one of the oddest stories of the past 18 months. When the first lockdown happened and the housing market was closed, fears of a big increase in unemployment, many people would have expected a housing crash, instead of which it got on its feet quite quickly. It was helped by ultra low interest rates. It was helped by the stamp duty cut. And it was helped by many people reassessing their housing needs, deciding they're going to be working from home a lot more than they were in the past. And that has produced the most surprising housing mini boom in history, I think, that you wouldn't have expected that to happen. And it continues. It continues beyond the end of the stamp duty cut, which was on September the 30th. We've also seen an increase in wages. Now, some of this, we got to 8% wages growth, average earnings growth a couple of months ago, which we haven't seen for 30 years. Some of that clearly is a distortion. There is a distortion caused by the fact that last year, many more people were on furlough. Most of those people who were on furlough were earning 80% of their normal salary or wages. And so you compare that with this year, with a much smaller number of people on furlough, and of course none at all now, you're bound to get big year-on-year increases. There are other sources of distortion in the figures, but the underlying pay picture is stronger than it was. We've been stuck at 2 to 3% earnings growth for the last 10 years or so. It's probably a little bit stronger than that, and it's very strong in certain particular sectors of the economy. So lots of inflation, lots of inflationary pressures. But when it came to deciding on interest rates, a lot of people, particularly in the financial markets, thought the Bank of England would raise interest rates on November the 4th, and it didn't do so. This is a real dog, by the way. It does bark, but it didn't bark on November the 4th, and nothing happened, despite some pretty strong hints from the governor of the Bank of England and from its new chief economist that interest rates might go up. Nothing happened then. And I think this was all about the Bank of England trying to prevent the markets from really taking things too far. The bank rate has never been lower than this, 0.1%. Bank of England has been around for more than 300 years, since 1694. Until the early part of 2009, bank rate had never been below 2%, through wars, famine, everything else. And 0.1%, it hasn't been above 1% since 2009. So I think the bank is still trying to sort of manage this. They know they're going to have to respond by raising interest rates. They still think quite a lot of the inflation coming through is temporary. They don't want to raise interest rates too much. They don't want to frighten the horses. So the kind of expectation that I think we should have about interest rates, about official interest rates, is that they go up to 0.75%, which is where they were before the pandemic, or even 1%. But they haven't been at 1% since 2009. But the bank will be reluctant to take them much further than that. And I don't think the people at the Bank of England think that we've yet broken out of this period of ultra low interest rates. They think it can, inflation can come down without taking rates back to the kind of levels that many of us will have been familiar with in the past. I mean, the Office of Budget Responsibility, interestingly, the official forecaster did an alternative scenario as part of its budget assessment, which was that, you know, interest rates would have to go up by more to go up to 3.5%, which they haven't been for a long time. You know, at one time in 2003, when interest rates were cut to 3.5%, that was the lowest level they'd been for 50 years. And we thought they can't stay that low for very long. These days, you know, raising interest rates to 3.5% would be quite a profound shock for the economy, a profound shock for the housing market, a profound shock for everybody who's got used to interest rates being very low. But that was that was an alternative scenario. I think the bank is quite determined to keep them quite low, and so that is going to be the challenge. But interest rates are definitely going to go up, possibly next month, certainly, you know, 2 or 3 or 4 times next year. So we should just expect that, and we should just hope that you know, the extent of it is limited. What about tax increases? Rishi Sunak has had, oh, I missed out an I there, has had quite a year for tax increases. I mentioned some of those earlier, adding up to, you know, 40 billion. None of it has taken effect so far. And I think there's a danger when you are in the business of announcing tax increases before any of them have taken effect, that you take it too far and you do too much in terms of announced tax increases. But these are the things that have been announced. Corporation tax is quite a big one. You know, a useful rule of thumb for the Johnson government's approach to tax is to look at what David Cameron and George Osborne did and do the opposite. So, you know, David Cameron and George Osborne's great emphasis was on cutting corporation tax, the lowest in the G20, raising personal allowances and thresholds by more than inflation, taking people out of tax. This government is doing the opposite on both of those things. The Chancellor's aim is to keep government debt under control. Government debt at the moment is in total about 2.2 trillion pounds. It's gone up by about 400 billion as a result of the pandemic. And this is one measure of government debt on this chart, which is excluding some of the things the Bank of England does. Taking those into account, it's roughly 100% of GDP, having been 80% of GDP before the pandemic. So the pandemic has added, you know, 20% of GDP to government debt, and the Chancellor wants it to be coming down relative to the size of the economy by the end of the Parliament. That is his ambition. His ambition is also to cut taxes. You know, there was a slightly jarring period, you know, section to the budget speech when, just after announcing all this extra public spending, he said, well, I actually want to cut taxes. Whether he can do that, or whether this was just a bit of political positioning, I don't know. But I think his aim is not to increase taxes further. And looking at the assessments by the OBR, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and others, you know, it looks as though the tax increases that have been announced will be enough to produce the kind of modest target of keeping the debt from rising further as a percentage of GDP. But there is unfinished business. You know, what do we do about, you know, green taxes? You know, how do you replace, if we're all going to be driving electric cars, how do you tax them? How do you replace the petrol and diesel duty? There hasn't been much yet. I mean, I think a lot of people expected there'd be more in the budget on green taxes ahead of COP26. There wasn't very much on that. One of his ambitions, in line with the recommendation of the Office of Tax Simplification, was to equalize the tax treatment of capital gains and income, taxing capital gains as income. That hasn't happened because a lot of entrepreneurs protested that would be a bad thing to do. But, you know, maybe it's still there in the background, as is bringing the tax treatment of the self-employed and the employed into line. And of course, the increase in national insurance contributions takes it further away, takes it further out of line. But I think also, and the reason I'm cautious about tax cuts is that there are still a lot of demographic pressures for higher spending. I think if I'm summing up the outlook, it would be that this is still we're in a strong recovery. It's not a a trouble-free recovery. You'll be aware that I think perhaps looking at it in advance, we thought if only we can get back to growth, everything will be fine. What we're experiencing is still good cause for optimism. It's much better that we've got strong growth than we flatlined after falling as a result of the pandemic. It's much better that that is being driven by a successful vaccine rollout here and elsewhere, and that we're moving beyond the public health emergency into a kind of more normal period of economic growth. And the stresses and strains that is producing will be are there and will be with us for some time, but they will ease as time goes on. So I think we should be cautiously optimistic about this. It's not often that you get the kind of growth numbers that we've experienced we're experiencing now and will experience next year. So I think there's good reasons for cautious optimism. Just to, I must finish by updating you on I've given you lots of economic indicators. My own proprietary economic indicator is called the skip index. It's based on the number of builder skips in my street. And if I can tell you how it works, if there are none at all, we're in recession, or there's zero growth. If there are two, we're growing in line with what economists would call trend growth. And if there are four, it's an unsustainable boom. And the skip index has been all over the place over the past 18 months. When the pandemic first struck, no building work was being done, and there were no builder skips on the street. And then everybody decided they were going to be working from home for forever. So we saw an explosion, not a literal explosion, but a huge increase in loft conversions and conservatory building and all those things. People wanted to make their homes more comfortable. So for at the time we saw four skips on the street. It has now settled down to to a manageable two, which suggests that things are reasonably normal. I now combine it, if you'll forgive me, with another index, which is the station car park indicator. And there's a station car park about half a mile from where I live, and I've been looking at the percentage capacity use of that station car park. During the worst of the pandemic, it was no more than, this takes people into central London, no more than 10 or 20% full. I started looking at it again recently, and I thought it was 80% full. This is very good. But then I looked at it again more closely the other day, and I noticed that people are taking advantage of the fact it used to be full to bursting, by the way, that it's not quite so full, but to leave a space in between their car and the next one. So it's probably only 60 or 70% full. We're not quite back to normal in terms of commuting patterns. That fits in with a permanent shift to greater working from home. Some other people have told me that they look at the lights that are on in lawyers and investment bank offices at night, and they've noticed that not so many are as used to be. But so we're not quite back to normal, as working from home is a permanent shift, as is shopping online. But I think we can be reasonably optimistic. It's a recovery that's bringing stresses and strains, but it is a recovery, and it will continue into 2022. Thank you very much for listening.